that means and have been through that personally. I'm just going to give you a couple little bites, data bites on her as we go forward. She's a globally recognized gender equality and organizational cultural expert. She believes that to tackle inequality, we need to fix workplace culture so they work for everyone. She's the host of a popular podcast called The Fix. And if you haven't listened in, you're missing something that's a real treat. And then I'd like to also make sure we talk about her book today. It's called The Fix, Overcome the Invisible Barriers That Are Holding Women Back at Work. She's also the founder of Equality Forward, a global consultancy that provides leaders with the assessment, development, and inclusion coaching needed to build cultures of equality at work. In addition, she's a senior advisor to the UN Foundation's Girl Up campaign, where she leads the Next Gen Leadership Development Program, which enables young women to navigate and overcome the barriers to their success. Prior to all of this, she was the director of inclusion at Netflix, and before that, she was the head of the UN Women's Global Innovation Coalition for Change, which includes managing over 30 private sector partnerships, as well as accelerating the achievement of gender equality and women's empowerment. So there is nothing about that that I don't love, and she is all that and a bag of chips. So without further ado, Michelle, welcome to Quorum, and thank you for gracing our lives today. We're really excited to hear from you. Uh-oh.
Let's see here, Michelle. We're having a little bit of a problem getting Michelle.
Oh, she's muted.
No, you know what? I've asked.
Her little mute is on.
Let's see here.
There she is.
Michelle?
Oh, darn.
Let's see here. Let's see here, Michelle. What can we do to get you?
Can she call in?
Yeah, Michelle.
Is there a phone number, Michelle? Okay. No.
She might try dialing out, dialing back in, like have her hang up. Sometimes it glitches, and just try to enter again. If that doesn't work, I agree with Marta. Just have her call in.
Can you hear that, Michelle?
Can you hear us? Oh, there she goes. All right.
Okay. Now you're connecting to audio.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, did it. Excellent. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry about that. I've been doing, oh, hang on. Let me just prop you up. I've been doing speaking events all day. Haven't once had a problem. And my very last one of the day, trust it all to go to a mess. So thank you so much for having me here. Such a wonderful organization with so many incredible women. I feel really honored to be here speaking with all of you today. And thank you for that wonderful intro. The topic for today that we're talking about is allyship and practicing allyship. You know, for me, my journey into becoming an ally and more importantly, a success partner to women really started about 10 years ago, when I began my journey as a researcher trying to understand how inequality worked in organizations and why it is that, you know, women simply don't advance at the same rate as men. And so a lot of my research really tried to unpack these issues in organizations. And so I've spent the better part of a decade really looking at, you know, a lot of the challenges that women experience throughout their careers, how this plays out differently for all women. What are the challenges that men experience because of gender inequality in organizations, and why ultimately, you know, equality stands to benefit not only men and women, but ultimately workplaces. And so a lot of my work today has really focused on all of that. And the first time I presented my research findings was at a conference. Nobody actually told me that this was America's largest conference for women. It was just an event that I got asked to speak at, and I thought, great, you know, I'll go along. I didn't do my research on it. I'd never even heard of Philadelphia, where the event was. And it turns out it's America's sort of largest event for women, 17,000 attendees. And Michelle Obama was presenting that year. We also had, you know, Sheryl Sandberg, and then I get up and start talking through, you know, why we need to fix workplaces and not women. And I was really, really nervous. And anyway, at the end of the event, there's this queue of women, and they come up and introduce themselves. And one woman came up to me and she put her hands on my shoulders. And I noticed she had like tears in her eyes, and I thought I was just getting sort of an introduction. But it was quite an intense moment, because she said to me, "I want you to know that what you said to me really meant something." And I was like, oh my gosh, you know, what did I say? And she said, you know, that we don't need to be fixed, that I'm good enough just as I am. I'm going to put that up on my wall at work. And that was a defining moment for me in my journey in talking about my research, because I realized I had to bring the story to women, you know, and the message that we really don't need to fix women. We really do need to fix workplaces. And actually, in understanding that message, it frees us. It frees us from, you know, having to conform to the outdated white male stereotype around what good looks like in organizations. It frees us from having to compete with one another for one spot at the leadership table. And it allows us to be ourselves at work and to be valued for that. You know, something we don't say enough to women is, you deserve a workplace that values you, and, you know, that values you just as you are. And so for me, this is really about, how do we create work environments that value difference? And that starts with really seeing all the ways that our workplaces are broken. You know, to be an ally in organizations really involves three critical things. It involves an awareness of how inequality works, and a disruption of your own denial around that. An understanding of what barriers we experience in organizations, and how this plays out differently for all women and men. And then importantly, you know, what your job is in terms of taking action every day to show up and be an ally and remove those barriers. And so the starting point for this is recognizing that, you know, workplaces are not meritocracies. They function in different ways for everybody. Because organizations weren't designed for difference. You know, the day I discovered this, I was interviewing 72 men and women in 2 different organizations as part of my qualitative research. And I was speaking with senior male partners and CEOs in this firm, and consistently these leaders told me that, you know, their organization, everybody was treated in the same way. You know, nobody experienced any sort of differences or inequality, because everybody was ultimately the employee. And so their organizations functioned like meritocracy. That's how they got to their position, that their experience and their view of the work environment must be everybody else's. And so that singular view that we apply not only alleviates us from having to tackle inequality, but it's a form of denial, and it's a coping strategy for actually working in organizations that, you know, inherently discriminate. You know, success discriminates. And so that was the point that I realized, actually, I need to do a better job of explaining how inequality works, because that's the starting point for realizing the privilege that some of us have and the role that we have to play in being allies. And so really simply, how inequality works, can't believe it took me 7 years to realize this, is that in most organizations, there's this hardwired, what we call it in academia, success prototype, a hardwired standard for what good looks like. And in most organizations across the board, research finds, you know, when you think of this ideal worker or ideal leader, you're going to think of a white, heterosexual, able-bodied male. But more importantly, somebody, you know, who's willing to make work the #1 priority and engage in sort of dominant, assertive, aggressive, competitive, and even exclusionary behaviors to get ahead. And the problem is that most people, you know, don't fit this ideal. In fact, the more ways you differ from the ideal standard, the more barriers you're going to face trying to advance at work. So for me, as a, you know, white woman, I have my whiteness in common with the white, heterosexual, able-bodied male ideal, but I don't have my gender in common. And as such, you know, they're challenges specific to me that I experience. But if you add in that sort of race and ethnicity, you've then got this double compounded experience of inequality, where you have to face both racism and sexism in organizations, and that creates an entirely new experience of inequality. So the barriers are compounded by difference. The more ways you differ from the ideal, the more challenges you're going to face trying to advance at work. And the reason that exists is because when people try and live up to the ideal standard in organizations, they're not just conforming based on demographic characteristics, that standard, to live up to that standard, to be seen like the ideal and the ideal leader, you have to engage in the behaviors that go along with it, which is, you know, if you've seen Mad Men, the TV show, you know, that's Don Draper, right? It's the dominant, assertive, aggressive, competitive, exclusionary, making work that number one priority. All those behaviors are really what go along with being seen as the ideal. And so when leaders lead in that way, they encourage employees to behave in that way. And that creates an entire lived experience of an organization that represents Don Draper. The problem we've got today is that 1950s model might have served us when everybody in the organization probably looked the same, probably had the same background, but it doesn't serve us today. And part of the challenge is making people aware that the system is even in place. You know, most leaders will deny that that system exists. Even in organizations, there's a large multinational professional services firm that I conducted my research with, one of the organizations. 95% of men and women describe their workplace as a Don Draper workplace, right? So said that these were the behaviors that good looked like. This was what it takes to succeed in this organization. And even with a data set of like 1,300 employees from different locations saying the same thing, leaders could deny that this was the case, right? It wasn't until white male leaders went and asked women to share their experiences of inequality that they started to believe the data that I had. And so that's incredibly challenging, because I think, you know, we often are tasked with having a business case for equality. And the problem is there's no business case that's going to capture people's hearts and even people's minds, you know, and it's inherently very misogynistic to say you need a business case for equality when, you know, you've never had to have a business case for having white male leaders in organizations. So the goal for me is really about understanding, you know, how do you create an environment that isn't based around an outdated 1950s prototype? And more importantly, why? So what are the benefits of having a work environment that kind of shifts from this outdated norm? And there's a lot. So the starting point for sort of why we would do it is because the 1950s model of leadership that we have in place doesn't serve us today, and it won't serve us in the future. So if you're a leader, that transactional command and control, telling people what to do, directive style of leading, you know, is not serving you today in a COVID world where you need to connect with your employees, you need to delegate because it's a remote workforce, you need to be able to collaborate, you need to foster collaboration through remote working. And all of that requires an ability to see the whole person, to have empathy, to understand the challenges people are going through, whether it's mental health, caring for a dependent, caring for children. All of that requires a new style of leadership. Importantly, that's known as sort of a transformational way of leading, right? So somebody who can do that empathy, that collaboration, that caring. And that style of leading is really what's going to serve us in the future world of work. So when we think about, you know, the transformational changes that are coming, not just with potentially more pandemics, but with technological advancements like AI, robotics, nanotechnology, the Internet of Things, that's really changing jobs over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. We're going to see about 60% of jobs change. Most likely, most people are going to be working with machines to some extent, or with people who don't look and think like them. And so we need an entirely new way of leading that is much more transformational. It's a way of leading where we're very clear about what we value, and we give people the freedom to demonstrate those values in a range of ways. So our idea of what good looks like is not built on this Don Draper ideal. And, you know, workplaces need this more than men and women do, because to compete in, you know, today's environment and increasingly in the future, organizations are going to need innovation, creativity, collaboration, diversity of thought. And that only comes about from cultures of equality, you know, environments where people feel like they can be themselves at work and they're going to be valued for that. You know, in those environments, employees are 6 times more likely to innovate. Men are twice as likely to advance to senior leadership positions, and women are 6 times more likely, because you're no longer advancing a small number of people that fit this 1950s outdated leadership ideal. And so all of that is the why, right? We know that organizations that have these environments are more creative, more innovative, more profitable, you know, they're more productive, they're just better workplaces. There's increased employee satisfaction, retention. So the business case is clear. But what we lack is an understanding around why each of us should invest in this. What's in it for me? Why should I be an ally, practice allyship, which enables the creation of a culture of equality? You know, if it's good for business, it's good for leaders, what's in it for me, right? And my message to everyone today is that, you know, creating a culture of equality ultimately serves you. And that's the starting point for building your awareness as an ally. You know, once you understand how inequality works, you realize that actually it creates barriers to everybody's fulfillment and advancement at work. So if we think about the cost of living up to the Don Draper ideal, you know, in order to access some of the privilege associated with it, you know, for white men, I assumed for the longest time that the system worked for them, and it doesn't. So, you know, research finds, in fact, my research in my book, it's a whole chapter for men that outlines all the barriers men face when they live up to the Don Draper ideal. You know, things like the bullying, the male silencing, you know, the not being able to deviate from Don because, you know, traditional sort of stereotypes around masculinity associate that with femininity. So something like being empathetic or sharing the challenges or your stresses or the mental and emotional load that men face at work carries it with the double burden of not being seen like a leader, but also not being seen like a man. And I think, you know, for the longest time, we haven't really enrolled men in a meaningful way in this conversation by understanding the challenges they experience because of cultures of inequality. Likewise, for women, I think there's a lot of work we can do to not only understand the challenges men face and to see men and enroll men in this fight, because it is their fight as much as ours. In fact, you know, arguably they need the freedom more than we do because they need to deviate from that 1950s model of leadership if they're to survive in the future. But for women, it's also about seeing each other. It's also about understanding, well, if I have my whiteness in common with Don Draper, how does that make it that much easier for me to advance? So let's take a common barrier that women face throughout their careers, something called the Conformity Bind, where to be seen as competent, right, like the ideal, you have to live up to Don Draper, right? So you have to engage in those behaviors, competitive, assertive, aggressive, exclusionary behaviors to be seen as the ideal. The problem for women in engaging in those Don Draper behaviors is they're actually defying standards that society holds for what good looks like for women, which is being meek, mild, unassuming, that sort of maternal, softer approach, right, to leading. And so the problem is when women engage in Don Draper behaviors, they're seen as competent, but, you know, they're not seen as likable. And likability is really important. So to be seen as likable, women have to engage in more feminine behaviors. So suddenly there's almost no right way to be a woman at work because you've got this trade-off between competence and likability, and both are extremely important to advance at work. The challenges all of this creates is really compounded by difference. So let's layer in race. Let's think for a minute about the experience of a Black woman with the Conformity Bind. Suddenly you've got the risk of being assertive in organizations, not only triggering gender stereotypes, so a woman's now violating standards for how women are meant to behave, but if you're a Black woman, you're also potentially run the risk of triggering racist stereotypes. So something like the angry Black woman stereotype, you could potentially trigger it simply by speaking up. So while I say often, you know, there's no right way to be a white woman at work, there's no right way to be, you know, any woman at work, particularly when it comes to understanding racism in organizations and how that creates tremendous challenges for any woman who differs in terms of their race against the ideal. And I think the important point for white women in particular who are listening to this is, you know, I always say what white women want from men in organizations, which is to understand the barriers and take active steps to remove those barriers. You have to be prepared to give to all women, and particularly, you know, racial and ethnic minority women. You know, for the longest time, feminism has left any woman from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds out of the fight. And, you know, feminism was stolen a really long time ago. And I feel that a large part of our advocacy starts with us recognizing and understanding our own racism, our own privilege, and our own prejudices. If you want to be an ally, that work starts with you. You know, for a lot of white women, they've never really explored what it means to be white or even define themselves as white. And so as a South African and somebody who grew up during apartheid, a lot of my anti-racism work really starts with me and understanding, you know, if my definition of being white is the devaluing of others based on their race and ethnicity, in the same way that being a man is defined by the devaluing of women based on their gender, you know, that is something that you need to reckon with and redefine for yourself. And so a lot of this work really starts with the self. You know, we think we're going to be an ally, I'm going to help people. And it's incredibly patronizing. If you want to be an ally, you know, you have to start with yourself. You have to start by exploring it. And it's not a case of blaming yourself necessarily for, you know, all the racism that exists in the world. That's not what this is. This is more about taking responsibility to understand that you're in a position of power, because in a work context, you know, you have that sameness in common with the ideal standard, which means it's that much easier for you to advance because you fit the unfair ideal of what good looks like. My whiteness in common with Don makes it that much easier for me to assimilate and advance my organization. And that's a privilege. Privilege is an unearned benefit that we get from that association. And so the job really of allies is to recognize that privilege, and rather than living up to it by engaging in the behaviors associated with it, spend it. Spend your privilege by taking action to work on yourself, to have the awareness of your own beliefs that might be prejudiced, your own biases, your own denial about inequality. We're all in denial about inequality, right? I discovered it with men, but I realized actually we're all in denial to some extent. I didn't know the barriers men face. Men believe that workplaces are meritocracies. White women don't understand the barriers that, you know, Black women face, or Asian women face, or Hispanic women face. We're all in denial, right? And so our job is to really disrupt our denial by growing our understanding and awareness, and by really investing our time, our energy and resources into educating ourselves and doing the hard work to get in the muck and confront the uncomfortable beliefs. Some of those are racist beliefs. Some of those are sexist beliefs. Women can be sexist too, right? And so a lot of this is confronting all the ways that we uphold a system of inequality in our workplaces through our lack of action, and through accepting things as the way they are, and through modeling some of those Don Draper behaviors. You know, great and powerful exercise I get people to do to try and disrupt some of their denial and thinking about this is to map your career and map those moments you've witnessed or experienced inequality in workplaces, and start to think about, you know, how that might have been experienced or felt and what you could have done differently in that moment. And so I think awareness is actually the starting point for this. But a key part of awareness is realizing that, you know, your role as an ally serves you. And I think if I can leave everybody with sort of one thing to remember, that would be it. Because often as allies, we think that, you know, we're doing somebody a favor, we're helping them, right? And that is not allyship. That's what we call performative allyship. That's not really allyship. Allyship is realizing that your success is tied up in my success, and that actually we have to create an environment where all of us can succeed and be ourselves at work. So a quick example that I have of this, which I love to share, it's a true story. And if you've watched my TEDx talk, you'll know the story. So on my first day as a manager, I was standing in the kitchen at work, and my boss picked up a kitchen towel and threw it at me and said, "Hey, Michelle, you're a woman. Why don't you wash the dishes?" And all the men who reported to me were sort of standing around laughing, right? And nobody said anything. A couple of them sort of avoided my eye. And, you know, it was incredibly embarrassing for me, an extremely male-dominated organization. And I wasn't really sure how to respond, because if I laugh, I'm laughing at a core part of who I am, which is my gender. If I don't say anything, you know, it makes it a bit, I'm sort of accepting it. If I do say something, I'm seen as difficult. And of course, because I have my whiteness in common with Don and I have some of that privilege, I decided to spend it. And so I turned to my boss and I said, you know, you've got two hands, why don't you do it? And I walked out of the kitchen, and he said, that's why I hate working with women, because they can't take a joke. And so that was my first day and my first sort of moment where I really realized it doesn't matter that I'm the most qualified, experienced, capable person in that room. I'm never going to be valued in the same way as my male counterparts, because fundamentally inequality is about devaluing people based on their difference and how much they differ from Don, right? That's how it works in organizations. And so for me, that was my moment where I also realized the important role that allies play. And I came across some research that really hits us home, which finds that simply witnessing that moment, so for the men who saw that and didn't say anything, that had the same negative impact for them as it did for me. So I just want everyone to think about that for a minute. So witnessing an inequality moment and not taking action has the same detrimental impact as if you had experienced it yourself. And the reason for that is psychological safety. So none of us like to work in environments where we feel unsafe, where we're not sure, whether we might be next, where we're not comfortable being ourselves at work, where we don't think we can speak up, where we're not sure if our contributions are going to be valued. No one likes to work in that environment. And so when you take action as an ally, it benefits you, because in that moment of taking action, you're turning that situation around to your benefit. So by advocating, you feel better, you make it safer for others. So simply somebody standing up to my boss in that moment and saying, you know what, that's not cool, don't say that. Or, hey, you've got hands, why don't you wash the dishes? Or, hey, that's not an appropriate joke, don't say that. Or, anything, any sort of number about, even outside of the meeting, taking the side saying, hey, that wasn't cool. I think you should check on Michelle and Apollo. Any sort of norm resetting would have been a powerful way to be an ally in that moment. And that would have, ultimately served the group as a whole. But instead we reinforce the Don Draper ideal when we're silent, and it makes it unsafe for us. And as a result, we're less creative, we're less collaborative, we're less innovative, because we're not then working in a safe environment with others. So that is my main kind of point around the awareness piece. And when you invest in doing the work on yourself, it actually serves to benefit you. So that's the first piece around awareness. The second piece is understanding. So how many people, in your organization truly understand how inequality works? How many people know about the ideal standard and how they live up to it, and how they engage in those behaviors, and how that creates, the barriers that exist in workplaces that men and women experience? Not many people. In fact, most leaders don't even know. Most leaders will probably tell you it's a meritocracy, right? And so our job is, as allies, is to educate ourselves and develop a deep understanding about the barriers. So, I hate self-promotion, but read my book, like just as a resource, if I could give it to you for free, I would just read as a resource as to what those barriers are. There's a book by Minda Harts called The Memo. Great book, read that. There's the excellent resources out there. Another one is Fair Play by Eve Rodsky that talks about the inequality at home. There's plenty of resources you can use to understand what barriers exist in organizations. And once you have that understanding and the awareness, right, you've invested in developing that, then as an ally, you know when to take action in those day-to-day moments. So the conformity bind and when to speak up, or the performance tax that women experience at work, where they have to work twice as hard as their male counterparts just to be considered as good enough as an average male. And knowing that allows you to take action. So quick example, I had a colleague who was probably one of the most talented Black women I've ever worked with. And she reported to me, and a white male leader, she'll never know this, but a white male leader, before she was about to present this workshop to his leadership team, had a Zoom call with me, and he says to me on the call, Michelle, I'm just not sure that she's quite right to facilitate the session. And immediately my brain's in overdrive, right? Performance tax, performance tax, performance tax. And I know that while it's hard for white women around the performance tax in terms of how hard we have to work, I know it's doubly hard for Black women in particular, who have to work, twice as hard just to be seen as good as their white female counterparts, right? Let alone their male counterparts. And that's because of gendered racism and how far away Black women are, from that white male ideal. And so knowing this, I'm hearing myself just say performance tax. And so I said, help me understand that. I want to understand why. So I advocate. I ask why. Why is a great way to advocate. And he said, well, you know, I'm just not sure she has the right gravitas. I was like, okay, so gravitas is a loaded word. Help me understand what you mean by that. Well, experience. Okay, do you know her background? No. Have you read her CV or LinkedIn? Like, where's this coming from? No. Have you ever seen her run a workshop? No. Okay. So I'm going to tell you about something called the performance tax. And I launch into my whole explanation as an academic, just so you're aware this exists. It's a bias. I think it's playing out now for you. I'd like you to be curious around that. And I'd like you to give this wonderful woman who's got a ton of experience an opportunity to facilitate this workshop. And then I'd like you to come back to me and give me feedback as to how she performed. So he was a little bit taken aback, but I could totally do this because I'm the director of inclusion, so it's my job. And as a result, this wonderful woman facilitates this incredible workshop. It's amazing. This leader comes back to me, tail between his legs, and said, absolutely, this is true. And by the way, I've bought a copy of your book. Brilliant, right? So, but the challenge in that situation is, had I not known what the barrier was, I wouldn't have been able to lean in and advocate. I wouldn't have been able to be an ally. That wonderful woman who worked with me will never know that I did that. And that is absolutely the aim. You know, as allies, the goal is not to get a gold star and a pat on your head. The goal is to advocate in the moment and remove the barrier and spend your privilege. I risked that leader getting offended that I might have been calling him a racist, getting offended that I was, you know, potentially, you know, how people turn it around and make it about them by using denial as a way to do that. How dare I ever say any, you know, I ran that risk and I was happy to do that, right? Spend the privilege away. But my goal was to get to a point where that leader could disrupt his denial. And more importantly, where my colleague could do her job. And so, you know, and as she is, without going in there fearing that somehow she's going to be treated differently. And so that was a really important learning point in my journey, to understand the goal of allies is really to remove those barriers and not have anybody know that you do it. And so I think, you know, that those are really the three aims to being an ally. You know, have that awareness, build your awareness, disrupt your denial, deepen your understanding about the barriers, how they show up. You know, and once you have that understanding, pay attention to your work environment. Think about when you've maybe participated in some of the barriers, when you've experienced them, what barriers you might experience, because we have different phases in our career and the barriers potentially show up in different phases. And think about when you've maybe witnessed inequality, and if that relates to a barrier, like try and understand what's happening in your work environment, get to know your workplace. And then once you have that, you know, pay attention to the day-to-day moments where inequality shows up. Inequality is a lived experience. We only solve it by tackling the behaviors and the moments that show up. And in doing all of this work, the most important thing to remember is that it's not about men and it's not about women. It's about making workplaces work for all of us. And you need this just as much as I do. And so your fight is my fight. We're in this together, and creating a workplace where, you know, you can be yourself at work ultimately serves to benefit you. And so in doing this, I just really implore all of you to realize that, you know, this is ultimately something that serves all of us. And women really need an environment where we can be allies to one another, where we redefine leadership, where we don't live up to the Don Draper ideal. Because in doing that, we're not only resetting the standard for what good looks like for leaders, but ultimately we're future-proofing our careers. Because a more transformational style is simply what will get us ahead in the future world of work. So I encourage all of you, you know, to carry that message with you that you don't need to be fixed, that it is your workplace. And by starting the work of fixing your workplace, you will be practicing allyship. So thank you all very much for having me speak and tolerating the setup with the mic this earlier. I really appreciate that. And I welcome any of your questions.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yeah, Michelle, this is
fine.
amazing. I can't wait to read your book now, and we'll have a link to that in the follow-up email. So first question is, in that kitchen situation, someone speaking up would have created that safety, but how does that ally feel safe from retribution?
Yeah, so I would, you know, I hate asking people who are marginalized against or discriminated against to practice allyship. I think that's quite a tough ask. And actually, it's what a lot of diversity and inclusion programs today are asking. So if we look at sort of target-based programs where we hire women into roles mainly because they're women, or you know, a lot of the programs that exist today where predominantly people who are being marginalized and discriminated against are asked to do more or to sort of manage some of the cultural change efforts, that's a very hard thing to do. If you're not in a position of power and privilege, it is very hard to disrupt a system that only supports people with power and privilege. And so the goal is really for me to call on my white male allies. And that's why in that example, I do hold the men accountable in that room. You know, most of them fit the Don Draper image. Most of them are white, most of them are male. And several of them came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, Michelle, I'm really sorry that happened." And I was like, no, you can't do this to me now. You need to advocate in the moment. You need to speak up. And, you know, that's what I mean by spending your privilege. Like, they have the benefit of being white and male and like their boss, that allows them to develop the social capital, network, engage, you know, have that likeness in common that allows them to advance. So spending something that they never earned in the first place, you know, is not really spending anything at all. You know, privilege is something that's unearned. And so for me, we're asking men to spend something that they never earned themselves. And, you know, men who do this, ironically, research finds, ultimately benefit from it from a career standpoint. So this is why the whole system of allyship is rigged. You know, when men advocate for women and diversity and inclusion, research finds they're more likely to get promoted. They're more likely to be seen as leader-like because they're now seen, you know, in today's system as being a more inclusive leader. So ultimately, you know, this serves white male leaders to do the right thing.
And building on that, are you saying that disruptors are only those that have privilege?
Sorry, you just say that again?
Are you saying that disruptors are only those that have privilege?
No, I'm not saying that at all, right? I think women can advocate for women. We're all in positions of privilege to some extent. So if you think of the, you know, all the ways that somebody could differ from the Don Draper ideal, you know, the white, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied male ideal, you know, we all have privilege to some extent. I'm just saying, if I'm going to ask anyone to advocate first, I would like that to be my white male leaders, which is why a lot of the work I do with corporations right now is with white male leaders. In fact, it's most of my programming to get them to realize that, yes, you know, it is hard for you, but it's that much harder for women. And, you know, if you start to see each other, we can understand and have that empathy and understand how to take action. So I think all of us can practice allyship, you know, and following those 3 steps that I talked about: awareness, understanding, and action. But for me, I think the work really starts with leaders. And in my book, I'm pretty ruthless. Like, I hold leaders accountable, and I hold leaders accountable in all the work that I do, because they're the ones who set the standards for what good looks like when it comes to behaviors and organizations.
Thank you. Another question: does devaluing stem from fear? How do we make it safe for women? Excuse me. How do we make it safe for men to support their female colleagues?
Yeah, so look, I think devaluing, that is actually what patriarchy and inequality and is all about, right? Like, if I had to summarize it, I would say we simply value men and masculinity more than women and femininity. So the inequality that we have in society is what exists in workplaces. So, you know, this idea that when I come to work, I become the employee and I walk in and, you know, is madness. You don't leave your biases and prejudices out the door. You're a whole person. And so this is the challenge that we have today, is we have gender inequality in society. And so inequality is actually everywhere. If you look at it, any occupation, it's literally pervasive. It exists in everything. And if you don't believe me, please just listen to my podcast. I'm on episode 150, and I've interviewed people from all walks of life, and it is literally everywhere. It's in the foundation of our society. And so seeing that it exists in society, it exists in workplaces. And for me, the revaluing is not just asking men to revalue, it's also about women revaluing what it means to be a woman, and understanding and revaluing, you know, this idea that I'm not asking everybody to suddenly shift from Don Draper to, you know, very feminine way of leading. The complete opposite. What I'm saying is give people the freedom to choose what behaviors they want to engage in, depending on what the situation requires. So in the future world of work, as we're in disruptive environments and there's a constant change, there might be times where you need to be assertive. There might be times where you need to be more dominant. And so this is about how do we give people the freedom to be ambidextrous, to have the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral flexibility that you need to respond to a situation. And that only comes about in organizations that value difference. Right now, our organizations don't value difference, and success discriminates based on who most closely fits the Don Draper ideal. So this is about, you know, cultural transformation in organizations where we start to value different ways of working. And I think it's happening. Like, I'm really optimistic. I think COVID's kind of kickstarted this process off that a lot of academics knew was coming because of technological advancements. And, you know, now we're seeing things like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, you know, that a lot of people reference, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. I've interviewed her, she's in the book, you know, who lead in a very, very different way, a values-based approach to leadership. And it's a shining example of all that you can achieve if you lead in that way. So I think it is happening.
Thank you. And as a note, we will be including a link to your podcast, The Fix, in our follow-up email so people can keep, you know, learning from you. Another question that's come in, could you give us your views on the difference between sponsorship and allyship?
Yes, look, it's a great question. And my second book I'm busy writing right now actually talks to this a little bit. I think, you know, the challenge with sponsorship is the way that it's worked historically is it's quite informal. So how it works is white male leaders find other young white male leaders that they trust because they're similar to them, and they support them. They advocate on their behalf. So when they're in a meeting and somebody says, how's that person going? Great, he's doing this, this, and this. And, you know, that advocacy is what leads to promotions. Knowing how important that is to advance and get promoted, organizations have tried to formalize it, right? Try to make formalized sponsorship programs. We know those don't work because you take away the magic when you formalize it. And what happens is you take away the magic of the connection. You take away the magic as to how sponsorship happens. And so you also, women don't receive the same, what we call organizational awareness from sponsorship programs. So when a male is sponsoring a female, he won't let her into the inner workings of how the organization functions in the same way that he would a male. So that's really interesting because the value is the organizational awareness. That's actually what a sponsor gives the sponsee. And they're also willing to spend their privilege, so advocate on the person's behalf, take a risk. And so increasingly, you know, we're seeing in order to make sponsorship programs work, we need people and leaders in particular who are willing to, you know, mentor, grow, sponsor, you know, and groom women into their leadership roles. So I actually talk about this in my book, that the single most important thing any CEO can do is have a diverse bench of candidates who could take on their role. And I share my example in my career where I worked for a CEO, and the very first day he was in his new job, he said to me, Michelle, my board has asked me to find my replacement and groom them over the next 3 years. And I had to pull a list together, and it was a list of 3 white males. Now imagine if that was a list of, you know, people who did not share the CEO's background, you know, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender. That would have been an incredible bench to mentor and groom, even if those people never got the job. And so that's really what we need to start seeing, is leaders thinking in a different way. You know, it's the same old tired excuse you get from leaders around, I can't find any, I mean, Wells Fargo, we saw that the other week, I can't find any, you know, black colleagues to hire in the marketplace. What an astounding thing to say. And research shows, again, if you want to have more diversity in terms of your leadership teams, well, the single most important thing you can do is to get your white male leaders to diversify their network, because then they'll know who to call on when an opportunity pops up. So I think this is about white male leaders taking accountability for the systems of inequality they've created. And, you know, my work is actually to make them aware of it and to understand what it is that we're asking them to do and how this serves to benefit them.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you think this concept of allyship should or can be incorporated into companies' programs of harassment, discrimination, hostile work environments?
Yeah, so I've got a very, and again, it's a bit of a harsh view on this, and I talk about it in the book a lot. You know, where you're at the point where, so I've worked with an organization where they had a big expose here in the UK about the sexual harassment and discrimination and actually sexual assault experiences employees had encountered. And, you know, this was what was so great in some ways about Me Too, is it called a lot of these experiences out. But I think the point at which your organization is there and your culture is there, it's broken. Right? It's going to need a lot more than allyship to do an overhaul. You need to get rid and cut out the toxic leaders that enable that environment to take place. You know, leaders drive culture, and culture drives experiences of inequality. And so the leaders in those environments are accountable for people's experiences of inequality. So, you know, it's leaders who ignore those telltale signs that something's going on, or, you know, suppress people when they speak up. That's what leads to those very toxic environments. So allyship in those environments is incredibly difficult because you've got leaders and people in positions of power who are maintaining the system that is toxic. And so for me, you know, if you're having those experiences in your workplace is broken. And, you know, that's an environment where I think women have to protect themselves and really think about, you know, a baseline requirement for every single man and woman in organizations is safety, physical safety and psychological safety. That's a requirement. And if you're going into your workplace every day, not sure if you're going to get sexually harassed or assaulted, that environment is broken and unsafe. And so I think for me, you know, that is a baseline requirement. If we start thinking about shift from baseline requirements to actually what do women deserve? Women deserve workplaces that value them. How do we rewire our policies, processes, practices, and beliefs about what good looks like to enable women to succeed? You know, how different our workplaces would look if women had designed them, or if somebody had designed them with like a working mother in mind. You know, I wouldn't have all the nonsense I have with COVID right now. You know, I'd have a work environment that understood the challenges and valued me. And so that's really what we're asking from organizations, is to shift from base level requirements to actually creating what we call an enabling environment.
Thank you. Another question is, how do we as women support one another and diffuse the competitive only one seat workplace?
I don't know who asked this, but thank you. This is such a good question.
Marta Hillgreen.
It comes up in every single event that I speak at, so it's a really important question. And my message to women is, this is really why positioning the awareness piece is a piece where you really need to start and dig deep and think about, are you leading in a way that actually lives up to the Don Draper ideal? So the reason this is so painful for women is when we see other women living up to Don and betraying the sisterhood to advance their careers, that breeds distrust. And so women, you know, there's a very disparaging term people would use in my study. They would reference, she's just a man in a dress. And that was a terminology people would use to describe women who lived up to the Don Draper ideal, women who, you know, knew that actually the only way for them to access power was to replicate the inequality they had experienced. And in doing that, you know, women lose themselves. The biggest cost to women leaders who engage in those behaviors is the loss of self, because, you know, men will never support you and include you in a system of inequality in the same way that other women can and will. And so I think for women, you know, for a large extent, we've inherited a way of leading that doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve men either. They just don't always know it. But it doesn't serve us. And so I think now is the opportunity to redefine what leadership looks like. As a woman, you know, like I wish I'd known that earlier on. You know, what is it that I value? How do I practice values-based leadership? How do I show up in a way that's true to who I want to be? How do I get rid of this notion that I need to somehow be fixed and start to accept that I have what I need to succeed? I need to lean into those strengths, because guess what? In the future world of work, I'm going to need them, and I need them today. I mean, I just very quickly for everybody, I did an incredible study where I asked participants, over 1,000 participants, what are the top 5
skills out of a list of 20 that you need in the future world of work. And they came up with emotional intelligence, inclusion, collaboration, all the things you would think of. And then I said, you know, out of those top 5, what are the skills that women have today? Women have 4 out of the 5 skills required in the future world of work today, on average. Men have 1. And this was both men and women saying this. And so for me, you know, men need this more than women do. Men need the freedom more than women do. The worst thing you can do is start to change yourself or fix yourself to fit into a system that's never going to value you, no matter what you do. You know, the best thing you can do is hang on to who you are.
Michelle, thank you. I could keep listening to you for hours longer. So unfortunately, we're almost at the end of our time. I guess one more quick question if we can. And
Sure.
And then I'm going to turn it over to Quorum's founder, Meg Sullivan, to close. So what are the 5 skills?
The 5, I'm going to, you know what? I'm going to get my copy of the fix. Hold the phone for
Or so if it's easier, you can give them to
I'm
me.
inundated. I can't, as a researcher, ever give you misinformation. So it's just, I'm hardwired for it. So you have to just forgive me, everybody. I will only ever give you information that's correct. It's one of my values. So the top skills are, top skills needed in the future world of work. Adapting to change and managing ambiguity. So that's the first one. Managing people to achieve outcomes. So that's linked to things like inclusive leadership. Achieving results and outcomes. Demonstrating emotional intelligence. And demonstrating resilience. So women had all 4. So of the 5, and men had 1. So the one that men had was achieving results and outcomes, which makes sense because that's more the Don style of sort of, you know, command and control.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
No worries. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, and I'm going to turn this over to Meg Sullivan now.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Michelle, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Your conversation when you started off, first of all, I love the notion of the idea that you fix the organization, not the women, which is or the individuals, which I think is incredible, because I do think we've been doing it backwards. So I love that notion because it sums it up so simply and allows everyone to wrap their head around it. So that was amazing. I was overwhelmed when you started about how much work has to be done. If you think about it, only because I'm sure everybody was sitting there going, oh shit, you know, the environment I'm in is exactly the wrong environment. So now what do we do, you know, from there? So I appreciate, it's the wrong environment for everyone, which is really what you said, which was just fascinating, because I think the default often is that it works for men, but it doesn't work for women. And in fact, you sort of dispelled that idea that actually doesn't work. It works for almost nobody. So that's sort of fascinating. I really loved the concept of spend your privilege. And so I think I'm gonna close with that notion a little bit. Spend your privilege, that really fascinates me as a notion, because I think this group here as leaders, everyone here are incredible leaders, with voices, with power to create change. You know, there's something really fascinating about challenging ourselves to consider that when and where are we spending our privilege to the good of a broader cause. So I love that notion. And I'm just wondering if we could all challenge ourselves over the next month to call out those moments for ourselves when in fact are we actually spending our privilege, and what does it look like in that spirit of what Michelle was talking to us around, you know, really creating awareness and understanding of those moments and then taking the action. So it's just becoming much more aware about it and actually acting on it. So that's my number one challenge to all of us at Quorum. We love having action items to take on. We love the challenge of that. So so that's my big challenge that I'm going to put to this group. How do we spend our privilege over the next month, and actually annotate it? call it out, spell it out so we can see it, feel it, think about it differently, maybe share with each other. I think that would be amazing. I have a couple quick other little action items I wanted to mention. Michelle's book, as she referred to it multiple times, I can't wait to read it. I haven't read it yet, but can't wait to read it because it's chock full of great ideas about how we can take forward this notion about fixing the culture, and I think that's fascinating. Diane's going to share information about how you can get a copy of the book. And also, I think Diane, you mentioned we'll also share links to Michelle's TED Talk, et cetera, because I think you'll enjoy both. That I did see, so it's totally worth your time. So take a look at that. And I wanted to just remind everybody about a upcoming event that we have, which I think everybody will enjoy on November 10th. So I wanted you to mark your calendars on November 10th. We have Jane Newton-Small speaking with us, and she's going to talk a lot about a book she's recently written. She's a renowned journalist, and she's done some great work talking about women in leadership and in politics. And given the fact that November is such a big month around politics, for, I guess right now is a big time too, but in the States anyway, for all of us, I think that would be fascinating. And she's done a lot of work around leadership and politics, so I think you'll really enjoy that. The other ask that I would make of everyone is please make sure that you're paying attention to both newsletters, and also if you haven't connected to Quorum through LinkedIn, please do so, because Diane is putting out and sharing all kinds of really amazing content, not only that I think you would enjoy, but probably your teams would enjoy, people in your organizations would enjoy. So, pay attention to that, because there's a lot going on there. And Michelle, I'm just going to end one more time saying we feel so honored and privileged to have had you with us today. And I really personally learned a lot. I hope everybody else felt the same. And thank you. And I want to thank all of you for joining. It's so great to see your faces. And boy, do I look forward to the day we can all be together, huh? Wouldn't that be nice? But anyway, it's really nice to be together virtually. So take care of yourselves. Have a great rest of your week. Be well.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.